Hello everyone, my name is Ben and I help people to understand anatomy and physics, and specifically how you can use anatomy and physics to improve your ability to lift weights. Today we're going to do a deep dive on all things related to the lats. Now the lats by surface area are one of the biggest muscles in the entire back. And what we're going to do today is we're going to go over the anatomy of the lats, we're going to go over physics related to how the lats actually function, and then finally we're going to talk about application to resistance training so that you can understand how to much better train your lats in a way that you can practically apply today. The lats are this big fan-shaped muscle that spans all along different portions of the spine, hips, and rib cage, and they all sort of run up into the upper arm. Now, obviously this isn't a perfect depiction, right? Jay Cutler here, this bodybuilder, is so massive that I had a tough time actually scaling the lats, right? So you see that sort of going off of his body here, but needless to say, there are three major portions to the lats. The first portion to consider is the upper portion, and the upper portion of the lats run from T7 to T12, which for those of you who don't know are basically just referring to spinal segments along the sort of lower part of the midspine. The middle region attaches all along the lumbar spine, so the lowest portions of the spine, and then the lowermost portions of the lats actually attach to the top of the hip and the iliac crest, as well as the rib cage. Now, all of these different fibers converge to the upper arm, so what that means is that although they have all this different span of attachment sites, they all converge to a very similar point. So in essence, all these muscles are connected by way of their insertion on the upper arm, but all of them can function very differently depending on the position of the arm and specifically what you're doing in the gym. So if we had to sort of make a little bit of a better visual to subdivide these regions, you can think of the upper region as the blue region here, you can think of the middle region as the yellow region or the orange region, and then you can think of the lowermost region as that green region at the bottom. And again, all these guys wrap up and in toward the upper arm, and although all of the lats attach to a very similar point on the upper arm, what you can see is the lowermost portions, so you're thinking about the sort of green and maybe the bottom half of this orange guy right here, they actually run up and attach the most highest point on the upper arm insertion. Whereas the upper guys, the ones that run more horizontal, i.e. these blue guys and maybe some of the top fibers of the orange guys here, they run much more horizontally and they actually attach to the lower portion of the insertion as compared to those lower portions which attach to the more upper portion. This is specifically because the upper fibers, again the blue ones, they run more horizontal. So they're going to interact and run into this upper arm more horizontally. Whereas the vertical portions, which run more vertically, they attach a little bit higher up because again, that is more continuous with their fiber direction. Now, all of the lats are innervated by a nerve called the thoracodorsal nerve, which actually runs out from the cervical spine down through the sort of brachial area here and then into the lats. And what you can see is when it enters the lats, it sort of branches out. And this is kind of a cool division to see. And it does have application to resistance training, specifically because those upper fibers run at a little bit more of a horizontal angle in accordance with the fiber direction of the lats at that point. But the lower portions actually run more vertically, in essence, meaning that the upper portions can contract and activate slightly differently than the lower portions. So although all the different portions eventually converge to that same nerve running up into the cervical spine, what they do is they actually branch out a little bit differently, which in essence means that we can actually train them slightly differently. And so because of this, I personally like to divide the lats, practically speaking, into really two major regions, the upper region and the lower region. And where I draw that line is somewhat arbitrary, but it seems reasonable to basically just draw it down the middle here and to make sure that we call this the sort of upper half of the lats and this the lower half of the lats, in accordance with the upper half being more horizontally oriented fibers or composed of more horizontally oriented fibers, and then the lower half being composed of more vertically oriented fibers. So now that we have a basic understanding of the different fiber directions of the lats and all the different portions of the lats, it's time to get a little bit more granular about their anatomy, specifically as it relates to how the function between the different regions changes. And there are two major things to point out here. The first is that there's minimal spinal influence from the lats. So although the lats do attach to the spine, they are not huge spine movers. If any of you are familiar, the erector group, which sits on the back side of the spine, those are major spinal extensors, major spinal movers, and the abs, which sit on the front side of the spine, are major spinal benders and rotators. So the lats don't have a strong influence in either spinal bending or spinal extending or even trunk rotation, but they do have an influence which is substantial on the upper body, specifically in the shoulder and the shoulder girdle. So let's now break down how each of the different regions functions differently on a real anatomy model.
So now we have a bony model, and to really understand this stuff at a more nuanced level, we need to be able to see the different joint positions and how the fibers change in relationship to the joint positions. That's what understanding anatomy is really ultimately all about. So this yellow guy represents the most vertical lats, the blue guy represents the middle lats that attach to the lumbar spine, and then the red guy represents the upper or more horizontal lats. Now, as you can see, all of these again converge to this point on the arm, which means that they all, depending on where the arm is, have an ability to pull the arm downward like this, or maybe if your arm is out to your side, they have the ability to pull your arm inward like this. But what they actually have the most amount of leverage for is motion between the clavicle and the sternum. This is called the sternoclavicular joint. And what you'll notice is if you look at the distance from where the fibers are to that joint, that distance is humongous. But look at the distance between the fibers here and the insertions here and this joint. It's actually much smaller. So the lats actually have a much better ability, depending on what you're talking about, to move the entire shoulder girdle backward like this into what's called retraction, and then also if the arm is overhead into something called depression. So what you'll notice is that anytime the shoulder girdle elevates like this, in other words, the clavicle, the scapula, and the upper arm pivot upward, whether your arm is down at your side or over your head, anytime you perform a shrug, these tissues here will perform the sort of anti-shrug kind of a motion. And they do that in addition to moving the upper arm. So what that essentially means, and what this means in practice, is that anytime that you do a row or anytime that you do a pull down to train the lats, what you also need to make sure of is that you're also allowing for shoulder girdle motion. You're allowing this clavicle and the scapula to slide forward and backward, and then you're also allowing it to sort of slide upward and downward depending on what you're doing, whether a pull down or a row. And the key thing to remember here is that the more horizontal fibers will act in a more horizontal direction, so they'll contribute more to this motion here, just a pure retraction of the shoulder girdle moving this way. But then the ones that are lower, these yellow ones, will contribute more to depression and shoving the shoulder girdle downward. So again, the vertical fibers contribute more vertically and they pull the shoulder girdle upward and downward like this, and the horizontal fibers will contribute more horizontally and they'll pull the shoulder girdle backward like this.
So now that we have a much better understanding of the function of the lats, specifically at the sternoclavicular joint and the glenohumeral joint, we can start to talk now about how specifically to train them, and in relationship to lifting, how we can load the different portions of the lats differently. So as we discussed in the functional anatomy section, the resistance, regardless of which of the lats you're trying to train, needs to be pulling your arm and your shoulder girdle either forward and upward or forward in some direction. Again, most of you are familiar with these kinds of motions. There's sort of like rows and pull downs and motions that are similar to those, but the specific angle that you choose to load your upper arm and your shoulder girdle at will more specifically determine which portion of the lats you recruit the most. And a really helpful rule of thumb that I like to think about is the fact that the more vertical portions of the lats, the ones that run more up to downward, those are going to be loaded most with more vertical motions. Pretty simple. And the ones that run more horizontal are going to target the more horizontal fibers, meaning that if I'm doing a row where my arm is being pulled forward in front of my body as compared to upward above my head, motions that sort of pull my arm forward more horizontally will recruit the more horizontal fibers, in other words, the upper portions of the lats. Now again, I want to make it very clear that regardless of what kind of motion you're using, there is tremendous overlap between recruitment of the lats. So there's no motion that you can do that's for only one portion of the lats and not at all for the others. So just remember that there is overlap, and anytime you're training any portion of the lats, some of the lats will still be involved, but we can create substantial differences in muscular recruitment just based upon the physics of the exercise and how we execute the exercise. So let's now look at some example motions where we would be training predominantly the lower portions or the vertical portions of the lats. So here's me on the left side of the screen, and I am executing somewhat of a vertical pull down motion. And what you can see, if I actually pause this right at the top here, is that this line of resistance, which is extending all the way up from the cable up to the top of the pulley, is pretty much in parallel with how those vertical fibers would run. If you can imagine the vertical fibers descending at a sort of straight angle downward toward the hip and toward the lower portions of the spine, you can see that my upper arm is almost parallel to the direction of those fibers. And again, that's a really good rule of thumb to use when you're trying to figure out how to train a muscle is, does the resistance that I'm using fall close to being parallel to the direction that the fibers are running, and as a consequence, the direction the fibers pull. And as we talked about in the functional anatomy section, what you can see is I'm really allowing my shoulder girdle to sort of shrug upward and toward the origin of the cable, because that's what's most going to maximally lengthen the lower portions of the lats as compared to the other portions and as compared to other muscles which may have similar functions at the shoulder girdle. And in addition, what you could notice as I start to move into a more fatigued failure kind of a rep, I'll go back here, what you can see is the range of motion actually starts to decrease because the shortest position, the bottom position, is a weaker position. And so if you're using a cable, it's more than likely that you're only going to be able to fatigue the more stretched position of the muscle if you're going to absolute failure up into that top end of the range. So what you can see is the last 3 reps, I'm barely getting any motion of the upper arm. I'm really just shoving my shoulder girdle downward toward my pocket, again, because of how strong that influence of the lats is at the sternoclavicular joint. So make sure that if you're doing a set to failure, specifically with a cable variation, that you're really emphasizing moving the shoulder girdle in addition to moving the arm, because after the arm stops moving, you're going to have a little bit more gas in the tank in your ability to actually reverse shrug the load downward. So here's another example of a more vertical motion, which instead of being single arm is now double arm. And what you can see is the exact same principles sort of apply, right? So at the top of the motion where my arms are more overhead, my upper arm is pretty much in parallel or close to it with the direction that those lower fibers are running. Again, the vertical resistance, the vertical arm path, the shrugging effect upward, all those things are going to contribute to training specifically the lowermost portions of the lats because of the direction of those fibers and how they actually influence the shoulder girdle. Again, what you can see is as the range decreases, I'm really just maximizing for shoulder girdle motion, where I'm trying to perform the opposite of a shrug here toward the top. And as I fatigue more and more and more, I'm trying to pull with my arms, but my shoulder girdles are really the only things that are moving, again, predominantly because of the strong function that the lats have at the sternoclavicular joint. So what might something for the upper half of the lats look like? Well, in the same sort of principle-based way, what I can understand is if I'm using a chest-supported row like this, I'm doing this single arm, and I'll show a double arm variation in just a second here, the direction of resistance in its relationship to my arm is much more horizontal, right? Think about, how this is my torso and this is the angle of my arm. It's much more horizontal, which means that it's going to be more aligned with those upper portions of the lats, the horizontal fibers. So again, if I draw a straight line basically from the resistance through my upper arm down and sort of the toward the backside of my spine, you can see that the upper fibers of the lats, which would be running sort of around this point, would have to resist that load pulling me forward to a much greater degree than the lower guys, which again would resist something that was pulling my shoulder girdles upward instead of that forward direction. So much like we mentioned, if you're trying to maximize for training the upper portions of the lats, you want some kind of direction of resistance which pulls your arm more forward as compared to more upward. And this is specifically because the upper portions of the lats will again contribute to moving the shoulder backward as compared to the lower lats, which would contribute a little bit more to actually moving the shoulder girdle downward. Again, there is tremendous overlap, and so all portions of the lats pull the shoulder girdle sort of backward and downward when the arm is in front of the body. But it's important to know that these differences are substantial at their extremes. So here's another variation of something that would train a little bit more of the upper lats as compared to the lower lats. Why? Well, because if I pause here and I imagine that I'm on this same sort of chest supported row machine, my arms are being tugged forward by the resistance. And because of that, the upper portions of the lats, which you can see sort of right here, those guys are going to contribute to moving the arm more in that sort of direction that's straightforward to backward horizontally as compared to upward and downward. So if I let this play out, what you can see is, again, I'm maximizing for that sort of reach that we discussed in the functional anatomy section. And specifically, as I come back, I'm not really trying to emphasize too much other than just pulling the arms backward behind the body, because again, those horizontal lats are really going to function to pull the whole shoulder girdle in addition to the upper arm backward as compared to downward. So again, the primary takeaway here is that the more vertical the resistance direction relative to the upper arm and relative to the fibers of the lats, the more that we can say that we're targeting the lower portions of the lats. And the more that we use a horizontal resistance, one which is sort of pulling the shoulder girdle forward in front of the body, close to 90 degrees of elevation, those are going to be motions which target the more horizontal fibers because that direction of resistance is nice and parallel to the way that those fibers are running. Now, something we haven't talked about yet that's really, really important in the context of resistance training and applying these concepts to the weight room is this concept of stability. Now, stability is basically our ability to resist motion, to make sure that as we're going through these motions, our body isn't moving all over the place, so that we can really, really just isolate down for recruitment of the lats and any other associated tissues that are involved in moving the arms and the shoulder girdle as compared to the spine. Remember that the lats do not play a significant role in creating spine motion, so if you're moving your spine all over the place, you're just decreasing the amount of output that you can create and the tension that you can create in the target tissue, which is the lats in this case. So here are two comparisons, one which is again on the left side of the screen, more for the vertical lats, and then one which is on the right side of the screen for the more horizontal lats. What you can see is that the stability that I need to create in the instance of a more vertical motion is more vertically oriented, not so coincidentally, meaning that if I'm doing a lat pull down, Where I want the stability is in something like a pad that will prevent me from being pulled upward. So a good rule of thumb here is if the resistance is vertical and pulling me upward, the anchor for that motion and the stability that I need to create for that motion also needs to be more vertically oriented, meaning that because I'm getting pulled upward toward the ceiling, I need something that is inversely holding me downward toward the floor. But this is very different from a motion that is more horizontal. Why? Because if the motion is more horizontal and the resistance is more horizontal, then instead of getting pulled upward, I'm actually getting pulled forward. And this is where something like a chest supported row, which I'm doing on the right side of the screen here, is really, really beneficial, because this pad, which is essentially just on the front of my chest, really sort of right underneath of my sternum and my front ribs, is basically preventing me from getting pulled all the way forward, where I would otherwise have to stabilize the motion with my spine and my legs, as compared to just sort of being able to pull and create output and tension through the upper portions of the lats. So the principle-based takeaway here is that the more vertical the resistance, the more vertical the lat recruitment, and as a consequence of that, the more vertical that the anchor of the exercise and the stability the exercise actually needs to be. And for the more horizontal resistances, the more horizontal lat motions, the resistance to me getting pulled forward and the stability and the anchoring for me getting pulled forward needs to conversely be sort of more horizontal in accordance with that direction of resistance. So in essence, what that means is that if I'm getting pulled upward, I just need something pulling me down. And if I'm getting pulled forward, I need something that prevents me from getting pushed forward, and I need something that instead pushes me horizontally backward. So for the lower lats, you need something that is holding you vertically downward like a thigh pad on a pull down. For the more horizontal lats, you need something that prevents you from getting pushed forward horizontally, which again pushes you backward horizontally. Now, some of these motions, as you probably already noted, I was doing with a single arm as compared to a double arm. And doing something single arm, although you're probably using approximately half of the resistance, creates different stability forces that we actually need to manage. And as a consequence of that, we need to change the way that we're using our body to make sure that we're stable and anchored. So let me show you back on my skeleton how these things are actually different and what we need to do to make sure that we're stable in the single arm variations as compared to the double arm variations.
All right, so when we're doing a row or a pull down with two arms and the arms are moving backward, what we really need to do is we need to stabilize our entire trunk from falling forward with all the muscles on the backside here in the erectors. So what the point of a chest support is it's something that serves as a physical block so that when you pull your arms, your entire trunk doesn't get thrown forward, right? But what happens when we do something with a single arm is that we not only have to deal with something pulling our arm forward and as a consequence our whole trunk forward, but now all of a sudden imagine if you were to be able to grab this skeleton's hand and you kept pulling it, pulling it, pulling it, pulling it, pulling it, pulling it. What would happen is the skeleton would actually turn this way. So with any kind of single arm row or single arm pull down, we have to deal with the additional layer of there's a different kind of force that's either trying to turn or twist us. So when we're doing something with a single arm, we not only need to have our front leg sort of forward, which I'll detail in the next section, but we also need to make sure that we're using the opposite hand to actually stabilize that turning force that we just described. Now in the context of a pull down, you can still have your hand here, or you can sort of push up against something above your head. But if you're doing a pull down, right, and think about it, if you're just doing a single arm pull down like this, your entire side of your trunk is attempting to sort of get pulled upward and outward this way. So what this means is that whether you're doing a single arm row in front of you or whether you're doing a single arm pull down, there's going to be some additional force that you have to account for other than just, you know, the motions that we already talked about where you're doing two arm rows like this or two arm pull downs like this, where in the case of two arm rows, you just need a chest support, and in the case of two arm pull downs, you just need a thigh support. When you're doing something single arm, you need to be able to use the opposite hand. So you need to, again, be able to sort of push forward if you're doing a row, or push something upward with the opposite hand if you're doing a pull down. In any case, make sure that you use the opposite side arm as well as the same side working leg.
So now that you have a better understanding of the differences in force between single and double arm pulling motions, here are two practical examples of how I actually manage these things in my own training. So as you can see by the example on the left, again, because I'm getting pulled forward and I'm getting sort of twisted and turned to the opposite side, I use two major things to help with my stability. The first is I use my same side leg to make sure that I'm not getting pulled in the forward direction. So in this case, if I'm pulling with my right arm, my right leg is forward, which is preventing me from getting pulled forward in that direction. But again, because it's single arm, I'm also getting turned away from my working arm by the resistance. And so what that means is I actually need to use my opposite side hand to push forward into something to prevent me from getting turned. Again, we use these anchoring and stability principles to make sure that our spine stays rigid and our hips stay rigid so that we can just isolate for shoulder and shoulder girdle motion. motion to maximize for lat recruitment. So again, in this case, if my right arm is getting pulled forward, I'm kind of being turned to the left. So I need to use my opposite side hand, my left hand in this case, to prevent that turning. And then I also need to use my same side right side leg in this case to prevent me from getting pushed forward. Now, if we look at the more vertical single arm variation, what you'll notice is that I'm applying very similar principles, but just slightly differently to account for the fact that as I pull downward, my whole working side of my spine is getting pulled upward in the opposite direction. So to prevent this from happening and to prevent getting side bent and turned all over the place, what I make sure of is that my right leg is really pressing hard into the pad. So what you can see is my right leg in this case is really anchored into the bottom of the pad. My left leg doesn't need to be anchored so much. And my opposite side hand, my left hand in this case, is actually pushing into the pole a little bit to the left so that I don't get turned away from that side, and also so that I don't get sort of side bent away from that side where I would otherwise lose some tension on the lats, and I would have to recruit other tissues like the abs and the erectors to hold me in position. So the difference between stabilizing these two motions is not super fundamentally different. I just need to remember two major things. The first is that I need to use my same side leg in most cases to stabilize the force of the cable either pulling me forward or upward. In the case of being pulled forward, my right leg is forward in this case on the video on the left, and my right leg is underneath of the pad in the video on the right. And then in both cases, I'm also using my opposite side hand to either push something in front of me in the case of the horizontal variation, or to sort of pull and twist me in the case of the vertical variation. In either case, regardless of whether the resistance is vertical or more horizontal, I'm using my opposite hand and my same side leg to basically create a counter force so I don't get twisted or moved in any way that's undesirable to training the lats. So we can summarize these principles by basically saying that a single arm vertical resistance, I need a more vertical anchor as we discussed initially, plus a force with the opposite side hand to prevent me from turning or getting sort of pulled sideways. And then in a single arm variation with a horizontal resistance, I need that more horizontal anchor where my right foot is farther forward in the case of the right arm row, and where my left hand is pushing straight forward in accordance with that resistance direction so that I don't get twisted or turned away from that working side arm. So now that we've covered most of the major principles that we need to understand, let's get a little bit more granular and nuanced about the anatomy of the lats and how you can specifically maximize for training the lats if that's a goal of yours.
So just to really put the icing on our cake in terms of understanding the lats, two major things. The first is that the lats you can essentially think about a cable, and the rib cage you can essentially think about as being a pulley. And so what that means is if you imagine a cable wrapping around a pulley, much like a cable wraps around a pulley, the lats wrap around the ribs. And what this means is that all of the different fibers, regardless of whether you're talking about the lower ones or the ones that run more horizontal, stretch a little bit more when the arm is sort of tighter to the body. So what that means is if I do a row and my arm ends up going out this way, you can see that all these fibers are sort of wanting to pull the arm downward toward the body. So ultimately, regardless of where you put your arm, that's where they're going to want to end up. So what it means is when you're doing a row, you're going to be able to create more of a lat biased row if you row tighter to your body, because again, that's where all the fibers are coming off of. They're coming off of the ribs nice and tight right here. And if you're doing something that's a little bit wider, like a wide grip row or even a wider pull down, yeah, of course they can still contribute to something like more of a pull down motion. But in the context of a row, all these fibers, or at least a lot of them, will want to again pull the arm downward. They won't want to continue to pull the arm backward. So the takeaway is that because the lats use the rib cage as this sort of a pulley type thing, keeping the arm tighter to the body is going to actually bias them more, whether you're doing a more horizontal type of row or whether you're doing a more vertical kind of pull down where you can pull tighter to your body. Now, in addition to that, another consideration to make is that because they are doing that whole wrapping around the rib cage thing, they can actually get some additional stretch by one of a couple things. So if I want to sort of maximally take these red fibers here, right, these horizontal fibers, which again are the ones that set highest, and I want to lengthen them most, well, just think about like how you would lengthen a string around something sort of cylindrical like this. What you would do is you would take the arm across the body like this, and you would be able to actually perform rows at a sort of angle across your body, because wrapping them around the ribs actually stretches those upper fibers more. And you could apply the same logic to the lower fibers, so you know, some of the blue and some of the yellow fibers, where instead of just sort of coming up in front of your body this way normally, you could actually allow the upper arm to come slightly across the body, because those fibers would actually orient around the ribs at a more vertical angle, again, contrary to this kind of a position. So all of the lats will stretch substantially if you kind of bring your arm somewhere upward and forward across your head, because again, they do wrap around the rib cage as a cable cable wraps around the pulley. So two major points there is that because of this whole rib cage relationship to the upper arm, keep the arm tight when you're performing any lat motion, whether it's for the upper lats or the lower lats, number one. And number two, if you want to gain some additional stretch in those fibers, you can bring the arm across the body like this to stretch those upper fibers more. And then you can also bring the upper arm sort of up and across the head like this if you want to maximally stretch those lower fibers. But either way, arms tight to the rib cage. Think about the rib cage as that pulley around which the cable of the lats is wrapping.
So now that we have a good understanding of how the lats sort of wrap around the rib cage and use it as this thing called an anatomical pulley, a cable wrapping around a pulley, let's look at how we can apply this to exercise and how we can change the execution to account for that. So this is a back view of the video that I showed earlier, and what you can see is I'm actually angled so that the cable is not just pulling me perfectly vertically upward or even outward toward the side. The cable is actually pulling my arms slightly up and across my body, and again, the reason for that is because the vertical lats sort of converge up into the upper arm and they run along the side of the ribs. So if you can create more space on that side of the ribs, you can lengthen them just a little bit more. And as a consequence of the arm being loaded upward and across the body in this direction, you can actually load the sternoclavicular joint to a greater degree relative to if the vertical resistance was just straight up and down relative to your torso. On the right side, what you can see is a very similar variation, but from a different angle. So it's a little bit more obvious that my arm is being pulled upward and across my face as compared to just purely upward toward the ceiling. And what you can see again in this variation is that I'm applying the exact same principles, where in this case, I'm using my opposite side arm to stabilize the motion, and I don't really even need much of my lower body to stabilize this because of how sort of locked in I am with that opposite side arm. But in this particular case, in either way, I'm basically making sure that I still use my opposite side arm, and to make sure that I use it firmly and I really press into a bench or I press into a cable stack or something similar so that I don't get yanked over to that side. Again, the counter force is what allows you to actually pull down with a high degree of effort, because if you don't have that counter force and I didn't have the stability here of this bench or of that cable stack, I would just be getting pulled toward the cable and I wouldn't be able to isolate my lats. So again, for the vertical lats, the arm basically just needs to be pulled up and sort of across toward the face to maximize for their length around the side of the rib cage and to maximize for stretch and load on the vertical lats, specifically as it applies to the sternoclavicular joint. Now, if we apply these same principles to the upper portions of the lats, the same thing applies, but we just need a different loading direction. So what you'll notice is in this case, I'm actually turned slightly into the working arm, so my arm is being pulled across my body, which is a little bit more apparent from this perspective, because as you can see, my arm is sort of oriented across my chest this way, and what I'm doing is I'm pulling a cable down and across my body tight to my rib cage to maximize for leverage of those lats. So it's important to remember that with either one of these variations, whether the more vertical or the more horizontal, you can't maximally stretch any of the lats if you're using two arms at the same time. So this is the potential benefit of using a single arm versus a double arm in a row or a pull down motion, because you can further maximize for stimulus and specificity and precision toward training the lats as compared to other tissues like the rear delts and teres major and things like the traps and rhomboids, which may help contribute to those motions if you are using a purely vertical or a purely horizontal resistance. So again, remember that the lats are basically these cables that just wrap around the pulley, which is the rib cage, and if you want to maximize for their recruitment, you need to stretch the arm either across the body somewhere in front of you or across the body overhead, and to make sure that as you do those things, you're using the opposite side arm so you're not getting turned or twisted away from working the lats. And then in addition, as we went over in the functional anatomy section, I'm keeping my arm nice and tight to my body so that I'm not moving away from leverage of the lats and so that I'm not moving into other tissues like the rear delts and teres major. So now that we've covered basically everything that we need to know about the anatomy of the lats and how to train them and the nuances of their anatomy, let's just break down some practical recommendations insofar as how I would go about programming for the lats within the context of a single week. So in general, if your goal is just to grow as much of the lats as possible, I would split volume relatively evenly between the upper portions of the lats as well as the lower portions of the lats. Now, something to consider is the fact that you may be doing other pull down or row variations. So if you're doing a lot of horizontal motions, you probably want to dedicate a little bit more volume to the vertical pulling motions, because there's a lot more overlap between the upper lats and the upper back as compared to the lower lats and the upper back. In other words, if you're doing a lot of rows, you're already getting a lot of stimulus to those upper lats, and so you might not need to do as many exercises that are specific to them. But if you're not doing a ton of rows, then splitting volume evenly between the upper and lower lats is probably a good idea. Then conversely, if you're already doing a ton of pull down type motions, you probably don't need to worry as much about the vertical lats, because there's a ton of overlap between any vertical pulling motion and any of the motions that I showed you. And so in that case, you may want to focus more on the upper lats instead. Again, you don't necessarily have to do this, because some people may have more specific goals in relationship to growing growing the vertical lats, which sit more sort of on the outside, as compared to the upper lats, which sit more on the backside of the spine, which create more of an appearance of sort of thickness from the backside. So you may want to say like, okay, in this instance, I'll dedicate 60% of my lat volume to the lower portions and 40% to the upper portions, or maybe vice versa if, again, your goals are sort of the inverse of that. So consider the overlap with the similar motions as I discussed, and make sure that when you break down your volume, you're breaking it down by sort of the different type of resistance that you're using, vertical or horizontal, and then you're assessing the overlap between the motions that you're doing for the lats and the other similar motions that you're doing for the other portions of the back. Again, overall, there's more overlap between the upper portions of the lats and the other upper back tissues, so that may be something to consider moving forward in your training. Overall, the lats are fairly simple to train. Just do rows and pull downs a little bit tighter to the body while maximizing for motion of the shoulder girdle altogether. And if you want to be a little bit more granular and specific about targeting them, you can use a lot of the single arm motion that I showed to target those tissues more specifically relative to other tissues that may act in a similar way. Please let me know if you have any questions about any of this stuff. I'm happy to answer any and all questions and comments. Leave them in the comment section below.